Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Vikram Chandra. Um, I think some of you might know who I am. For the others, I should do a little bit of a short introduction. I'm a writer. I've written both fiction and nonfiction, and I've done some work in film and television. So before we start, um, let me give you a couple of uh, uh, hints about how this webinar platform works. Somewhere on your screen, you should see on the right-hand side, I believe, a panel that has Q&A in it. And so you can post questions in there and you can upvote them so that the most popular questions will rise to the top. And we'll keep some time, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes at the end, depending on how much it takes. I'll make sure that we have time at the end for Q&A. And the other thing I should say is that the laptop that I'm doing this on has disturbingly been crashing once or twice in the past 10 days. So if I suddenly seem to disappear, just hang on. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Okay, so let's start actually talking about what we're going to talk about, which is to say, how should you structure a novel, and how should you try and make that structure as effective as possible in terms of keeping your audience reading. Um, so I made a bunch of slides that I hope you can see on your screen. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is a very influential book. We're not going to start with fiction, but in architecture. This was published by an architect named Christopher Alexander in 1977, where he says a pattern is a careful description of a perennial problem, and then you can describe one of the configurations which brings life to the building. So what he's talking about is if you are going to build something, a human habitation in a particular place with a particular climate, with a set of seasons, if you observe throughout history what people have built there, what is most effective, you'll discern what he calls a pattern language, right? So you'll find a bunch of solutions that address the problem of this environment. So you could think of one of those Mediterranean cities which has a particular climate. And if you go to one of those cities, you'll observe that there is a big square in the middle, a public square. And the temples and the public buildings, the council building, are all located around that empty square. Um, and then there's the habitations which stretch outwards from that. So if you can work out what these solutions are to the problem, you can use them in a pattern language again and again and again, and therefore then you're able to use these elements, bring them together in this pattern language. As he says, you can use this solution a million times over without ever doing it the same way twice, right? So it's in a sense it's like a language, right? We have, say, a limited amounts of letters and words, but we can keep creating new things in there. So I hope that makes sense, right? And those of you who are programmers will know perhaps of this book, right? Because programmers in the 80s read Christopher Alexander's book and they realized that they were facing the same kind of issue, right? When you make software, you keep trying to address similar problems across a wide range of particular instances. They also started publishing these books of reusable object-oriented software, like particular small solutions to large problems that you could combine again and again to solve these particular problems. Okay, so the question is, do we have a pattern language for fiction? And more particularly, do we have a pattern language for novels? Can we take these solutions that we see in books, perhaps throughout history, and then use them in a smart way to construct our own novels? And the answer, it turns out, is yes. Right? Humans are storytelling animals. We've been telling stories for thousands and thousands of years, and people have been thinking about how to solve the problem of making effective stories for thousands of years. And I mean literally thousands. So the most influential book or person probably in the West in the western half of the hemisphere to think about this was this guy called Aristotle, right? And you all know about him, right? Uh, he was the teacher of Alexander. If you've seen that Oliver Strange movie about Alexander, with what's his name? I always forget names, in a terrible blonde haircut. His teacher, Aristotle, is played by Anthony Hopkins. And so Aristotle wrote a book called Poetics, in which he tried to address how is a good tragedy made and how is a good comedy made. And he is particularly referring in this to drama, to plays. So right at the start, at a crucial point in the book, where he talks about tragedy, he says, tragedy is an imitation of an action that is complete and whole. A whole is that which has a beginning, middle, and end. Right? Now, this might seem like a kind of obvious statement, right? But that second part is especially interesting. A whole is that which has a beginning, middle, and end. Oh, there's a typo there. I should have said has a beginning, middle, or end. So what implications does this have on what we're talking about, how to construct a novel architecture? So I'm going to show you, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to do a couple of drawings with my very meager drawing skills to try and show you what these implications are, right? So suppose we draw a narrative or a play, right? And we say there is a beginning, middle, and end to it, right? So there's three parts. So how are these three parts divided? There's a beginning, middle, and end. Make sense? Okay. So notice that I've drawn the beginning, middle, and end in different lengths, and that is actually intentional. And now if you look at the beginning, middle, and end, it should start to become obvious to you how this is familiar. This is the famous three-act structure, right? Three-act structure for narrative, for movies, for every kind of thing that you can think of. And now against this linear drawing of the beginning, middle, and end, if we plot what you could call the arc of emotional tension, you could say that at the beginning, the tension, the dramatic value, or the tension generated in the audience, right at the beginning is pretty much zero, right? And then what happens is that the writer might describe the landscape, might introduce the protagonist, so there's a slight rise of emotional intensity. And then after that, as soon as we enter the second act, it starts to go up and up and up. And then at the end of the second act, there's a kind of downslope, right? Which is the end. It's the family shot. It's the wedding shot, right? Or the wedding sequence, the family riding away into the sunset in a wagon, and so forth. So how do we know we've crossed from the beginning to the middle? Well, when the conflict of the story becomes clear, which is right here, I hope you can see this, that's when you've crossed from the beginning to the middle, right, to the second act of the story. So to use an example, and since we've just gone through Christmas, I'll use the example of Die Hard, right, which is my favorite Christmas movie. And you'll remember what happens in the first act of that film. Bruce Willis is a New York police detective who's flying to Los Angeles on Christmas to see his estranged wife and hopefully his kid. So in this first act, he goes to his wife's building, the Nakatomi Towers. He chats with them, they have an argument, and then we cut downstairs and a bunch of bad guys come in, right? There's an assassination in the lobby of the building. We cut downstairs to the basement, and Alan Rickman comes out of a van with a bunch of nasty looking guys. And instantly at that point, we know what the rest of the film is going to be about. It's going to be about Bruce Willis finding and killing those guys, right? How do we know when we cross from the second act to the third act? Well, this right here, the peak of this mountain, is the climax, right? It's where the conflict enters a stage at which the protagonist has to exit either with victory or defeat, success or defeat, right? And this, in the case of that movie, according to me, is the moment at which Alan Rickman steps out holding Bruce Willis's wife, and he's got a pistol on her, and Bruce steps out into the corridor, and you know this is the big showdown with the big bad guy, right? And it's got to go one way or the other, right? So what we get is this peak-like affair. I should also say that the middle, which is sometimes called the complication or the rising arc, is the longest usually of the three acts. And the arc of tension actually doesn't rise straight up. It actually goes something more like this, right? It's a series of steps. And why is it a series of steps? Well, because if you imagine a movie in which Bruce is killing people for, I don't know, for 60 minutes, one after the other, it would actually get pretty boring, right? And also, you need these flat parts in the middle, in the subsections between moments of action or forward movement to give the audience a place to relax, right? And it's only then when the next steep arc becomes valuable, right? It generates tension. All right, so one could say, okay, Aristotle, you've done this. What is the purpose of this whole thing, right? And so he talks elsewhere in the Poetics where he says, tragedy then is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and whole. And what is the purpose of this exercise? What you want to do is have each incident arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish its catharsis of such emotions. Right? So this is an interesting part because he's talking about emotions, right? And when he says pity and fear, he's using them in the most general terms. He's saying that pity is all of the sympathetic emotions, love, empathy, and so forth. Fear is all of the negative emotions, including anxiety and I don't know, disgust and so forth. And what the artist or the playwright does, along with the actors, is arouse this pity and fear in an artificial way, right? So if I'm watching a horror film, I get these bursts of fear, right, all along the narrative. And why are you doing this? Because you want to achieve catharsis. Now, catharsis I've left untranslated there because it's an interesting word. It literally means emptying out, right? In the sense that catheter comes from the same root, the Greek root, as catharsis. So his idea seems to be that a good citizen goes to the play, to the theater. They watch this Oedipus, perhaps, this terrible tragedy. It arouses pity and both fear. And then by the end of it, somehow this emotion is emptied out. So you come out calm, right? Feeling calm and emptied out of all these feelings. So I should say that scholars in recent years have actually started translating some of them catharsis as a kind of purification, right? It's not actually an emptying out, but it is still a dissolution. It's something that you get out of. Another interesting historical way to think about this is that Aristotle's teacher was Plato, and Plato famously argued that artists are not good people to have in your utopia, in your perfect republic. Because what artists do is tell lies, and they arouse the emotions of people through this dramatic display, which is not a good idea for a republic. And so you could argue that Aristotle is actually arguing against Plato, and he's saying, well, not really. These are the good things that you can do by arousing emotion. So just take a note that in this case, it's the purpose of the dramatic structure that we just talked about is to do something to the audience's emotions. Now, on the other side of the world, in India, people are thinking about this too, and thinking about it at length. And the Indian version or counterpart to Aristotle is a man named Bharata, who wrote a treatise called the Natya Shastra, somewhere between 200 BCE and 200 CE. We don't really know. It's hard to fix. Natya Shastra means literally a treatise on drama, right? So he again is addressing plays. He's thinking about plays and the dramatic art. Although the Natya Shastra is an interesting book, it has sections about dancing and music and so forth as well. So the Indian aesthetic philosophers and people who are watching drama do an interesting analysis of the structure of a narrative, um, although they do it from two viewpoints. And so, from the point of view of the protagonist, you could say that the inception, which is where the dramatic tension is zero, often in Indian plays there's a prologue. So this is the part of the prologue, and then the conflict is introduced. The protagonist makes an effort to achieve his victory, his goal. He sees the possibility of attainment, then he sees the certain attainment of the result, right, through his struggle, and then he reaches the result, right? So again, you've got a kind of broadly similar structure. What they also do, interestingly, is an analysis from a structural point of view, like 5 sections or 5 junctures which occur during the shape of a narrative. So there's an opening, again, zero tension, zero emotional dramatic tension in that place. Then there's a progression, right, towards the conflict. Once the conflict starts, there's a development which goes higher and higher. And then interestingly, they introduce this idea of pause right before the end, before the climax, before the conclusion. And that's, I think, a really good thing to pay attention to. That pause is that nighttime scene before the last battle, right, where typically the commander wanders around his troops, encourages them, and then the next morning the two sides form up on the battlefield, and then they fight, and one side achieves victory, the other side achieves defeat, and then there's a conclusion, right? Again, that last moment in which you understand what has been lost and what has been won. So that pause is a really effective technique, and if you watch movies especially, you'll notice this again and again. If you read novels which are well constructed, you'll often see this pause right before the big fight, right before the final conclusion. So you can see sort of familial resemblances between Aristotle and Bharata, but the understanding of psychology in India is very different from the one that Aristotle models for us. And I'm going to try and talk about it by talking about Game of Thrones. So I'm going to try not to give away spoilers about Game of Thrones in case any of you haven't seen it. But the scene that I'm talking about is towards the end of one of the seasons. There's a very crucial combat between two men, right? So these are single men fighting each other in a duel, and a lot hinges on the result of this duel. The forward movement after this will be in large part determined by the result of this duel. And you'll remember, those of you who are Game of Thrones fans, that people who had read this book, when the seasons were playing, they often set up cameras to record the reactions of people who hadn't seen what was coming, right? And I mean, it's a kind of nerdy thing, but there's a great pleasure in watching the reactions of people coming, who are reacting to something that you know about that they don't know about. So some people, I don't know who, on YouTube had put out this video of two guys watching this very crucial combat, right? And this is during that duel, and I don't know why there's a big garbage bag kind of thing floating above the guy's head, but I think probably is to block out the light, right, to make the camera more possible. So they're watching this episode, this crucial combat. This moment is full of dramatic tension, as you can tell from the way the guy is holding his t-shirt to his mouth. And then there's a sudden reversal in this duel, right? So there's one guy that I think most of the audience is rooting for, and he seems to be winning, right? And then there's a sudden reversal in this combat. And this is what happens, right? So one guy puts his hands up in the air because he's so shocked. The other guy has his hands over his face, and his jaw is literally dropping. He can't quite absorb all of this stuff that's going on. So then the guy on the right in the orange t-shirt is still a bit confused. He says it's a draw, right? Because of this sudden reversal, he's so confused by it. The guy that we've been rooting for, I don't know if this is a spoiler or not, but he gets defeated in this duel. So our man on the right says it's a draw, and the other guy replies it's not a draw. He's fucking dead, right? And notice that this guy's arms are still up in the air, right? He's still shocked and flabbergasted by what has happened, right? And now, since this is a duel towards the end of this episode, the screen goes to black, the ending credits roll up the screen, and these two guys, if you can find this reaction video, sit there for I think a good 30 seconds, just stunned, looking like this, until finally orange shirt guy says that was good, right? So the thing that the Indian aesthetic philosophers really wanted to ask, the question they wanted to address, is how is it that you watch something so bloody and gruesome? And I should say that the end of that duel, the defeated person dies in a particularly grotesque, gruesome way. His wife or his girlfriend is screaming. If you're watching something so horrible and heartrending, how can we say that that was good, right? What exactly is happening in terms of our emotions inside us? So the Natya Shastra has something interesting to say about this. And rasa, I should say, the word that they use for the final feeling or what good drama evokes, literally means juice or taste. And what the Natya Shastra says, sensitive spectators, after enjoying the various emotions expressed by the actors through words, gestures, and feelings, feel pleasure. This final feeling by the spectators here is explained as the essence, the rasa, the taste of theater. So notice the emphasis on pleasure, right? As with the orange shirt guy, how can we feel pleasure at watching tragedy or something disgusting or something heartbreaking or something erotic, something joyful, right? We have all these feelings. And so what their explanation is that we know that the emotions which are being evoked by us are not real emotions, right? I'm watching a play or a horror movie, I feel fear. So I know that this fear is not actually real. Something that would make me run in real life, I can sit and watch with pleasure, right? Why? Because I'm watching it or concentrating on it, or all my attention is focused on it in a way that allows me to taste this emotion like I taste rasa, like I taste juice, right? So there is a distinction being made here between the emotion evoked by the drama and the actual pleasure that one gets from drama. And so what they did is they constructed a kind of table of, on the left-hand side, the emotion that the drama evokes, and the rasa or the pleasurable taste that the viewer or the reader gets out of it. So notice on the left, you have things like anger. What you taste on the right is the aesthetic pleasure of what they call the furious. On the left, you have fear, right? Fear portrayed on the stage. On the right, you have the heroic or the terrible, and that's the aesthetic pleasure of tasting fear. And I hope this makes some kind of sense, right? But the reason I want to go into all of this is that this idea of pleasure through art has a real effect on the way that narrative is constructed within this context. So I'm going to make another drawing with my meager drawing skills. So if you look at Indian narrative, Indian drama, what it looks like is something like this, right? So there is one arc after another. Why? Because if you're getting pleasure out of watching something, then after you taste fear, you want to taste, I don't know, comedy. You want to laugh, and then you want to taste tragedy. right? So why stop? Just keep feeding me, right? And also, the emotions that are evoked in these different parts actually are more enhanced because of um, of them being put next to each other, right? Like complementary colors seem brighter when they're put next to each other. You can think of a good Indian meal. The tastes travel all the way across your palate, right? And that's what makes a wonderful meal, is that you taste these different things. Um, this makes sense also in the way that what Aristotle is talking about is a single action, right? There is a one particular action that is portrayed on the stage, and so you want everything in the play to be connected to that central conflict. He does, though, talk about centrality or unity of action, which means that everything must be connected to that central conflict. So on the other hand, in this, if you've seen traditional Indian movies from any part of the subcontinent, you know there'll be tragedy, um, soldiers fighting on the border against something. The next scene, somebody will sing a song, right? Which is very confusing to Western viewers, but in India, to us, uh, a well-made Indian movie does exactly this, right? So the other thing to notice about this is that if you look at this arc, it is starting to look actually strangely like a novel, right? Because a novel has chapters, and each chapter has an arc, and then the next chapter has an arc, and the next action has an arc. So, so the reason for this kind of longish preamble that I have been telling you about is the thing to realize is that the purpose of fiction, or the purpose of drama, the purpose of film, is to evoke emotion, right? And what you need to do with your drama is, with your novel especially, is shape your novel so that it evokes emotion and it keeps your audience's attention from one chapter, throughout one chapter, and then next to the next chapter, and then to the next chapter. So now we're getting close to the idea of a pattern language for fiction, right? Are there models that we can use that actually use this, that actually demonstrate this, and we can model our own narratives on them? Oh, so I'm going to go back for a minute to my drawings, and then maybe do a new one. So now let's draw the chapters of a novel, right? Um, uh, Oops, what's going on? My drawing is failing me. Okay. Okay, now it's working. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so now you have, let's say this is a chapter, this is a chapter, this is a chapter, and then continuing into the future of the narrative, right? So each of these chapters ideally should have an arc, right? Forming something like this, right? So that what you have is the protagonist or some other person who's not the protagonist, maybe the antagonist, maybe you have several protagonists, facing some kind of conflict. They either win or they are defeated, and usually it's defeated because you want the person to go on to the next arc. But you can also have victory so that the detective finds one clue, a crucial clue, and is able to interpret it, and therefore she is able to go on to the next chapter, right? And to trace that clue. So what you want then is to construct this in this way that then makes each chapter worth sort of attracts the attention, focuses the attention of the reader, takes him or her through this arc, and then leaves them, importantly, at a kind of place, at a question, which will lead them to the next chapter, right? And this is that novel that you love, that you start reading at 8 o'clock in the evening, and it's suddenly 3 a.m. in the morning, and you don't know how you got there, and you want to go to sleep, but you just have to finish, I don't know, just one more chapter, you tell yourself, and then it's 3 chapters later, right? The same kind of thing that Amazon Prime and Netflix have made available through this idea that you stream all the episodes of an entire series together, an entire season together. So again, you spend the whole night watching it. And if you look at their episodes and analyze them, you'll see that they're very carefully constructed exactly like this, right? So at the end of one episode, it'll leave you with some question that will lead you to the next one. So I should also say that the masters also of these were 19th century authors, right? Both in India and in the rest of the world, because they often published their novels as in newspapers and magazines, one section at a time, one chunk at a time, maybe 3 or 4 chapters, and then you have to wait another month for the next section or the next chunk to come, right? So at the end of 3 chapters, you have to do something really effective so that the person would pick up the newspaper or magazine a month later and want to know what's going on, right? So then for them, this cliffhanger, or whatever you want to call it, this curiosity arousing moment in the plot would be particularly strong at the end of this month's chunk. So one other thing that you can do really to keep the reader reading is what I refer to as delayed gratification, right? And what I mean by that is that if I am ending a chapter right over here, the question or the thing that I leave unanswered at the end of this first chapter is not going to be answered in the second question, or not even addressed. It's going to be addressed in the third chapter, right? And then again, whatever is addressed, whatever is left hanging here is addressed not in the third chapter, but in the fourth chapter, right? And so what you can do is make this kind of chain of alternating, or even you leave something for 3 chapters and come back to it later. So what this does is, when the person goes from the first chapter to the second chapter, they're drawn not only through the arc of the second chapter, they're drawn by the curiosity of what's going to come out in the third chapter. In a confessional way, I should say that I wrote a novel called Sacred Games, and some of you might have read it. And I use this method extensively in that novel. So I have 2 protagonists. One is a gangster, one is a policeman, a cop. And the first 2 chapters are told from the point of view, in a linear fashion, from the point of view of the cop. But then when the reader reaches the end of the second chapter, he or she realizes that the third chapter is told from the gangster's point of view. And whatever is left hanging here, the reader is not going to get the answer to that, is not going to get the next section of the narrative for that until the fourth chapter, right? And then throughout that novel, what I do is alternate points of view, right? And so it was lovely for me to understand that as an effective way of doing that, because I think, at least for some readers, that was very successful, right? They felt that reading it, they were drawn through the novel by this technique. Okay, so delayed gratification, I think, is a really, really effective way of constructing narrative. But sorry about that. Oops. Okay. I should say also that you don't have to do delayed gratification only through the structure of alternating chapters. You can actually also do it within. What happened? Okay. So if you draw just one chapter like this, and this is the beginning of the chapter, and this is the end of the chapter, you can actually implement delayed gratification within the chapter itself. So I've been rereading several of the novels of Elmer Leonard, who is one of my favorite crime writers. He's such an amazing writer. And what he does is he'll tell one part of the chapter from the point of view of, let's say, character A. Then he'll put a pause in there. And then when you start reading the next little chunk, you'll realize that it's from the point of view of character B. And often he also switches location, right? So whatever is left as a question over here might be answered in the third chunk, which is over here, right? So again, there's this effect of chaining, right, of being drawn through the chapter itself by this method of raising your curiosity and then delaying the answer, right? And again, if you read a novel that you like, that you think works, watch out for this, right? Writers will often deploy this. I should also say that and this might sound weird to you at first, that apart from delayed gratification, actually one of the pleasures in reading novels is digression, right? And what I mean by digression is that central conflict is not necessarily the only thing that gives us pleasure, right? You can actually divert from that central conflict and do fairly long, I don't know what you want to call them apart from digressions, side arcs or movements to the left or to the right, underneath and above, that then come back to the central narrative in somewhere in the future. And one of the most amazing early versions of a digressive narrative was a novel called Tristram Shandy, which was published from 1759 to 1767 in that serial manner, one volume coming after another, by a guy called Lawrence Sterne. And it's about 590 pages long, and he digresses endlessly. Like the whole novel is digressions, essentially. The hero doesn't get born until chapter 4, and then once the hero is born, the protagonist is born, Sterne keeps explaining the pre-story of the protagonist's birth, so you don't really understand how the birth happened till much later in that. And this novel actually raised a lot of controversy when it was published and ever since, because people were frustrated by it. Some readers were frustrated by it. So apart from that, if you don't want to write a digressive novel, you still have to open it up to some extent, right? And what I mean by that is that what I've noticed is that a lot of early career writers, especially people who are just starting to write novels, in their first or second versions will write what is essentially a longer version of a short story, right? Everything will be focused around a central narrative. But what that does is that it makes the reader, even if the reader doesn't realize this, feel claustrophobic, right? A short story is often described as a single slice of life, right? Often there's only a single action. That's why you can write an amazing short story in 2 pages. But a novel needs to open out. It needs to have subplots. It needs to have more characters than a short story, because it has to suggest something of the messiness of real life, right? And I don't mean that it should become completely shapeless, but it should do something in its elegant architecture that actually makes this complex world come alive to the reader. So it's important to remember that you don't want to turn this into what Henry James called a loose, baggy monster, right? We don't want that. But a bigger novel needs more content to it, and part of putting more content into it is putting more, I guess, what you could call digressions. And then the trouble is also towards the end of the novel, if you put all these apples in the air, you're juggling them, you have to bring them all down effectively at more or less the same moment, right? Maybe the last 3 chapters is where all these arcs are coming to an end. So how do you achieve an effective architecture? Well, first, think about what your protagonist wants and how your protagonist will change across the length of the novel, right? What obstacles lie in the way of the protagonist or protagonists, right? And then what this exercise will give you is the central conflict, the central direction. You break that central direction and that central conflict for all of the characters, not just into protagonists, into chapters, each of which have their own arc, their own satisfaction. And then you use, if you want, that chaining technique to take us through the entire arc. Think about what you're trying to do. Are you trying to write a thriller? Are you trying to write a literary novel? How big is your novel? If you're trying to write a tight thriller, probably that central single arc will lead you in very fruitful directions. If you're trying to write something else, well, consider who is the audience that's going to be reading it. what are the expectations? Are the expectations going to be Tristram Shandy-like, or are the expectations going to be what one gets from an Elmer Leonard novel? So is this the only way to tell a story or to think about a story? Absolutely not. So this is one of my favorite books that I read last year about how to construct narrative by Jane Allison. She's an amazing writer, and also she teaches fiction, creative writing. And she writes this, the book is called Meander, Spiral, Explode. And what it does is other methods of constructing narrative. And notice the use of the word pattern in the subtitle, right? Design and pattern and narrative. And what she does is that right from the structure of a sentence, then through a paragraph, through a section, through a chapter, she explores how you can structure these things. And it's a brilliant book. Although I should say it's a bit kind of, it's not exactly academic, but it's dense, right? And to read it, you really need attention. Oh, another kind of disclaimer, I should confess that one of my short stories is discussed in this book. But really, I'm not being, the only reason why I love this book is not because of that, right? So in this book, she discusses a novel called The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. This again is a brilliant novel, but it does have a central moving thread, a central chronological thread, but nothing particularly dramatic happens during that thread, right? It's about this young woman, who is growing up over several years in this particular neighborhood, and then often in that narrative you get these recollections or these vignettes as figures or situations. And as Allison observes, this motion easily keeps the novella alive in what she calls a bright agitation. And then, as I was saying, she also observes the story does have a central line, but twisting around it in regular repetitions are vignettes feeding that line as it rises. I see a spiral staircase revolving with many small polished steps around a single axis, right? And I think this way of describing it is absolutely true. I should also note that Allison criticizes the intense focus or the obsession that many writers have, or various cultures have, on writing these Aristotelian narratives, or these narratives structured around a particular kind of conflict. That particular kind of conflict is often described as a series of battles. Many feminist authors or scholars in the last, 3 decades have also, funnily enough, compared that rising arc structure to the curve of sexual excitement in men, right? So at first it's at 0, then there's a great deal of agitation, upwards rise, then there's a climax. I intend the pun there. And then it goes downwards, and then at least one partner turns over and goes to sleep, right? And so what they see in that is a particular way of thinking about the world, and they argue that there are many other ways of structuring narrative and seeing life. So I guess in terms of practical questions, how do you figure out what the structure of your novel is going to be? And I'm afraid I don't have a simple answer for that. Unfortunately for me, the only way that I can find the structure is by writing and revisions. For Sacred Games, I wrote 17 revisions of the same novel, and it's a 900-page monster. I hope not a loose, baggy monster, but a monster nevertheless. And I was looking at my various revisions yesterday, and I think I only discovered in chapter 4, or had the slightest hint of how the novel was going to be structured, which is to say it's actually structured like a mandala, that figure that you often see in Indian iconography across several spiritual traditions, which is to say a figure that has many different sections in it that look at first glance disconnected, but then finally are all connected when you observe them closely. And I don't think it was until chapter 7 and until revision 7 that I actually started implementing it. I've often seen that people who work in film and television, especially big commercial film and television, because they have a much more defined structure. If you think about your typical action movie coming out from Hollywood, it very much has that 3-arc structure, right? And so they'll work right from the beginning in being able to fit it in that way, right? And I've actually seen that 3-act structure drawn on the wall, and then people will give notes and they'll say, well, in the middle of the second act, there's a drop in tension, so you need to put something in there to make the tension, to keep the tension going up. But as for me, doing that is impossible. I've tried to do it and failed miserably, so I kind of wander through the narrative for the first many, many revisions, and then I figure it out, get a hint of it, and then finally by revision 10 or 12 or 14, I'm actually able to implement it. Give your manuscript to a person you trust to read and ask them to react. And if you want to focus on structure, ask them to think particularly about structure. Maybe you have 2 or 3 people that you can do this with. Listen to them with an open mind, but finally you have to rely on your own instinct, right? What you're feeling in your stomach, because you can't make art by committee, right? You listen to other people, but you finally end up constructing it according to what you want to do. And then read and read and read, right? Because if you find a novel that really, I'm sorry for that, I think you must be hearing it, this bonging noise. I must have forgotten to switch off some noisemaker on my computer. Oh, stop it, be quiet. Anyway, so if you find a novel that works for you really effectively, that moves you, and that does that thing to you where you spend the night reading and you can't put it down, then read it 10 times, read it 20 times, read it 30 times, and then try and figure out what that writer has done to make you feel that way, right? Draw out the architecture on the wall. I particularly, I think in a visual way. So drawing stuff out and, on a piece of paper or on a wall, sometimes really helps me to make sense of what I'm trying to do. I think that's it. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. I've closed that question and answer thing. Let me see if I can find it. And I see some questions. All right. Any tools to create a catharsis? I don't know about tools. I think, like I was saying, for me, the major tools are, I guess I would call them tools, is thinking about them architecturally, thinking about them in terms of structure, of how they've done it, how the chapters are made. One other thing that I did indeed forget to say is that narrative art, right from the bottom, is a rhythmic act. It's kind of like music, right? So a sentence, then another sentence next to it, creates a kind of rhythm, and you can manipulate that rhythm right at the sentence level, then from a paragraph to another paragraph, and then also from chapter to chapter, right? And then Allison, in the book that I just put up on the screen, is amazing in talking about that. So that might be worth reading. The next question, apart from the linear or chronological plot lines of novels, can we also look into different narrative structures? I think we did a little bit of that, right? The House on Mango Street. There are novels that work by kind of putting one piece to another next to another with not an orderly chronological structure. And the energy is maintained by leaping across the section breaks or the section breaks across the novel. Of course, as I try to think of it, my mind's gone completely blank. I often tell my students at the beginning of a class that I'm going to forget everything. I'm going to forget. So that's not very helpful. Again, I would recommend reading Allison's work in order to get an idea of that. I did write a nonfiction book, in which I tried to do that, which is called in America and in the West it was called Geek Sublime in the English translations. Well, in the English versions in India it was published as Mirrored Mind by Penguin. And that was very hard for me to write because I usually rely on this forward movement. But I don't know if I would recommend reading it unless you're interested in pre-modern Indian aesthetic philosophy and computer programming. Third question, how do we keep readers engaged in long narratives? I would say, again, through this idea of delayed gratification and chaining of narrative, right? Again, I think some of the best work in keeping the readers engaged in long narratives is right now being done in long narrative television, right? A lot of that work is conspicuously and based on the 19th century novel structure. So I would say two things. Watch these series because some of them are just brilliant, and then also read some 19th century novels, right? My favorite 19th century novel is Trollope. And my favorite series of his, it's a series of 5 novels, is called the Parliament novels, because these are all novels set around the Parliament in London, around politics in the UK. But they're also interspersed and filled with love stories, stories about hatred. So I would recommend looking at those. Is the hero's journey also a form of structure? Absolutely, right? And that's, I think, the most ancient form of narrative, right? Going right back to Gilgamesh, right? So what you do is you put your protagonist perhaps on a quest, right? And the quest then becomes the structure, right? The structure that leads you forward through the narrative, right? So you have things like the Hercules goes on his 12 labors, right? And so you can also introduce episodicness through that forward movement. Um, Don Quixote, for instance, it's a long story, I would say. I mean, it's a long story, but has this episodic structure. Tom Sawyer, right? They're floating down a river, he and Huckleberry Finn, and then each time they get off the boat or the raft to go ashore, something happens that is dramatic and exciting in itself. Could I show the Rasa slide? I should do that, sure. Oh, one thing I should also say before we get off the slides is that this is a book that I found really helpful and that I use in pretty much all my writing workshops. Um, uh, it's not as, let's say, dense at all like Allison's book, and it has a lot of stuff in it apart from plotting, right? Character, how time passes, all of that stuff. I especially noticed the 10th edition on this, if you can get it, because the earlier editions until the 9th were really expensive because she had included a whole bunch of short stories in there, and paying to republish short stories in your own book is really expensive. So that, if I remember correctly, was something around $60 US, and the price for this 10th edition has now come down to, I don't know, $13.99. It's also available as an ebook on Kindle, so that might be very useful to get as well. Let me try and find the Rasa slide while I keep on talking. Oops, there we go. There we go. Okay, while we look at the Rasa slide some more, those of you who want it, visualization is a great technique. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've been told that my writing is especially filmic. I think that is probably because I grew up in a family obsessed with cinema and still is. I watch a lot of movies, and so in film and not just in film and television, but in fiction, if you can make the reader actually see landscapes, you can suggest emotions to them, these rasas, without actually making them explicit, right? And that actually, I should say, and this is more about writing than in plot, it's on every page of your manuscript, and it's not only the visualization, or the eyes are not the only effective sense to use. You should use smell, you should use hearing. My teacher, the great American writer John Barth, actually used to call that technique crossing the senses, right? So if you're using, something visual in one paragraph, perhaps 3 sentences down you use smell, right? So the whole world of the world that you're creating becomes alive in a sensory way to the reader. Next one, agents want dual point of view. I've heard them say it's more work on voice. I guess that's true. I haven't heard that myself, but again, I would say that voice is again another essential thing, right? You always want voice and style to be reflected in your sentences. Voice also applies to character, right? So if you have 2 points of view or 3 points of view, each of those you hope will sound slightly different or very different. Again, to suggest to the reader, where does this character come from? What is the history of this character, etc., etc. The writer that I was talking about, the thriller writer, is Elmore Leonard, Elmore, Leonard, Leonard. His books are all over the place, and luckily for us, he's written a lot of books. So yes, if you're interested in crime writing, in thrillers, do go read them. A bunch of them have been made into films, the most conspicuous one being Get Shorty, with John Travolta in the lead. Does the advice on chapter structure hold true for audio series or drama? Any additional advice for that form of content? Yeah, absolutely. I think it does for audio drama as well. And I know that my friends, I have a couple of friends in India who work on that, and they absolutely use this. I grew up at a time in India where we didn't have many choices for entertainment. You went to the movies, television. Those of you who are of my age will remember was really boring. Krishi Darshan, remember Krishi Darshan at prime time on a certain day of the week. So one of the other really important mediums of entertainment was radio, and I remember listening to radio and turning up every week to listen to particular story audio programs. Does the advice on chapter structure hold true for I think that was the last one, which is good because we're arriving almost at the end of our hour. And before we actually end this, I want to go back to the very end. So I'm thinking that I'll do kind of regular episodes of this series. What is going on? It's actually going backwards. Let me see if it'll flip over. Yeah. So I'm thinking of doing regular episodes of this. If you have a particular subject that you would like me to address in the next one, please write to feedback@granthika.co. You can also find the website at granthika.co also. And I'll take a look at that and figure out what you would like to watch, what you would like to discuss, and then we'll get back to it. And I think that's pretty much the end of our time. Thank you for coming. I hope it's been useful and somewhat of a pleasure. The talk had some rasa for you of its own. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.